Welcome to Transform Now, a podcast focused on intelligent automation and brought to you by SS&C Blue Prism. On this program, we talk about how organizations globally are rethinking the way they operate, utilizing process orchestration and AI-enabled digital workers to free up humans to do the work that matters most. We also share insights and tips on how you can embrace this new way of working and unleash your full potential. Let's get into the show.
Hello everyone, Brad Hairston here. Welcome to Transform Now. Aaron Denman is a returning guest who's with us today. Aaron is a partner at Bain Company, and he is their utilities and renewables practice leader in the Americas. Aaron and I are going to be discussing the growing tension between the rapid expansion of AI-driven technology and the increasing demands for sustainable energy solutions. Aaron, welcome back. Can't believe it's been 3 years since you were with us last time. So why don't you reintroduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, Brad, thank you for that. As you said, I lead Bain's utilities and renewables practice. And obviously, since the last time you and I chatted, a lot has happened in the world. And we're going to talk a lot about data centers today, but will be important, I think, just to talk about data centers and the demand that's coming on the load side in context of what's happening sort of globally around the electricity system. So appreciate you having me on the podcast again today, and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, you bet. And you're right. A lot has changed in the 3 years since you were last on the podcast. The little thing called generative AI popped on the scene, and that has definitely changed a lot. And there's been a lot of articles, a lot of white papers, a lot of people presenting and talking about the impact that AI is having on energy demand, but there's a lot of other things going on. And so perhaps before we dive into the AI topic, you could just talk about global energy demand in general and some trends that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, no, happy to. I think that context setting is really important. I mean, again, if you think about 3 years ago now, we didn't really have the Inflation Reduction Act in the US or some of the kind of similar policies we've seen in Europe. And so probably two and a half years ago within Bain, we started to see some of these things out on the horizon to say, take the US as an example, 20 years of relatively flat load in the country. And so we sort of worked through the capacity situation in many markets, but we saw this trend of, okay, we're going to be building more manufacturing capacity, not just in the US, but sort of globally. The big trend around sustainability and how do we decarbonize the power system, which is one thing. But then if you take industrial loads, if you take fossil assets that are going to electrify, transport's one that everybody talks about, that's going to be a huge amount of additional electric demand on this system. And then if you think about other technologies around hydrogen, particularly green variety of that, again, more electric demand. And so this data center wave that has come related to the generative AI sort of topic, but AI more broadly, is an additional adder to what we were seeing around electric demand. And so we often sort of phrase it as a little bit of everything all at once, but these little bits of everything also come in much larger chunks. And so the systems ability to handle that additional load is going to be challenged, not over the near term, but how do we sort of modernize the system to be prepared for that level of demand over the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, let's talk about AI and just the power sourcing topic and what that looks like going forward. It's my understanding that when a user prompts ChatGPT, that it uses approximately 10 times more energy than a Google search. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what I've heard. So why exactly has AI power sourcing become one of the hottest topics of the last year or two?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different ranges in terms of what you see, but I think directionally that point sort of still holds depending on what model, but there's a significant amount of investment and power going behind that to pre-train these models. And so as we interact and use that, right, we're sort of using those pre-trained models, but also sending information back to continue to train and upgrade those models. And so what you had is a long wave of data center build out, but the efficiencies of those data centers often kind of offset a lot of that kind of capacity with the GPU chips and the generative AI boom. And now sort of almost an arms race amongst these large
Right.
language models to be early into the market, you see a really extraordinary amount of power demand to sort of serve that, to serve those loads. And I think the big question is, are we going to continue to see more advancements on the chip side, in the data center side to continue to offset that? I think it's hard to believe that'll happen over the very near term to
Mhm.
completely offset that demand. So we see pretty strong demand on the power side over the near term because of that reason.
And we didn't even talk about crypto mining and some of the energy consumption issues there. Certainly, they haven't been as substantial as that for Gen AI. Gen AI has become so much more pervasive, so much faster, but definitely lots of change going on in the world of technology, all of which has a definite energy impact.
Some of those loads on blockchain or crypto, you could often flex depending on when you needed it. So putting into low cost locations where you get the ability to turn it on and off. I think one of the other dynamics around the generative AI piece of that and the data center build out there is those loads are much more, they need much more firm power. And so they're going to be on significantly the vast majority of time. And so when you think about even some of the stuff that we saw earlier, which was going to be these large data center loads, it did had the same profile as what we're sort of seeing now. So it's
Mhm.
just the context of like a lot of demand on the data center side, but
Right.
also the need for that to be relatively firm as we go forward.
Yeah. Well, given the surge in AI-driven data center demand, how do the utilities plan to respond and mitigate this in light of what they're also trying to do around decarbonization?
Yeah. Well, let me think about like where the utilities are right now. Obviously, they're seeing a lot of this demand. I think one of the things the utilities are trying to understand is how much of what the signal they're receiving on demand is real or not. That's the big
Mhm.
thing that utilities are working through. We're partnering with our clients on is because if you sort of add up all of the utilities that are announcing how much is in their data center queue, it's really extraordinary. And I think when you step back, it's hard to believe that all of that is unique, that there isn't
Mhm.
duplication in the market. So where do we take out that duplication across what we're seeing in different service areas? So utilities are thinking about that. So as we build power, how do we make sure that we can actually build the right amount of power for what we see, that the true demand that's actually going to sort of show up? I
Mhm.
think the other thing is the planning apparatus for utilities is changing. A lot of the long-term planning, often you'll hear it of integrated resource plans. Those were much more of a 10, 20-year view on terms of power needs. What we're talking about now is how do I build for the next 24 months? How do I build for the next 4 years? And so really rethinking the planning process of what's the theoretical max of that demand? What's my true supply that I can build? And then how do I redesign the way that I construct and put power into the system? Now, that's thinking about like new builds that you may require, but we're also start thinking about, okay, how can I use demand response? Where can I do
Mhm.
interesting things on the transmission side to increase capacity? How do I put storage in, which is maybe smaller units, but can scale more quickly? And then to your question of balancing the decarbonization goals, there's a big question of if I have to keep the system really reliable, do I extend gas assets or do I extend coal retirements at least for a few years just to make sure that the system is reliable? You already see some data on that in the
Mhm.
US in particular. And I think that is a struggle of having our decarbonization commitments, but recognizing that the most important thing right now is system reliability. And so we may have to extend fossil assets more than we would like to be able to sort of
Mhm.
meet that need.
Yeah. And that leads me to ask you just about emerging renewable technologies and what role they may play in addressing all of this data center demand that's out there. I know that there are some limitations of solar and wind in
Yeah.
terms of powering data centers, but what do you see happening there?
Maybe I'll start with more renewables is a good thing. I think we're sort of seeing a recognition we need to continue to build out solar. We need to continue to build out wind. So I think while there's new stuff we can talk about sort of longer term, I think it's hey, something that we know is in front of us. We need to continue to sort of build that out. I think that
Mhm.
the challenge is when you marry the large scale for some of these data centers and the firmness they need for that power, it's quite challenging to serve that with renewables and storage alone. You can do that in certain parts of the U.S. as an example, or where you have certain ability to stitch things together. But outside of that, the thing that we're often sort of seeing is, hey, how can we bridge to where we're going to get more renewables in? So you may see some smaller, actually tend to be gas related assets, kind of bridge to power to sort of help with the initial wave of that DC build out until we get more renewables onto the system. And then I think if we look out over the horizon, I think it's starting to say, what is the role of nuclear as we serve data centers that are this large? And I say role of nuclear, broadly speaking, meaning we may still need the really large fission reactors. You see more momentum around that. And then I think there's quite a bit of exploration on the small modular reactor side, and then even some exploratory bets on what fusion might do, which again, is probably still a long ways out, but an increasing focus of if we need this much power and it needs to be this firm, one of the only solutions, if you want it clean, is to think about, is there a bigger role for nuclear to play, at least in serving this data center demand as we go forward?
Our good friend nuclear makes a reemergence right at the nick of time. I did see that AWS recently purchased a data center that's right next door to a nuclear power plant. It's a nuclear powered data center, and that has gotten a lot of people's attention. Do you think nuclear is finally at a place where it can shed some of the negative PR and misperceptions, if you will, that have been out there for so long that have kept it from really growing and becoming a bigger source of energy for some countries like the US? I know some countries, France, Ukraine, many others depend on it very heavily. Not so much the US, but there's certainly potential for that.
Maybe a couple thoughts I would share around nuclear. I think the tone or the tenor around the nuclear conversation is changing. There's public polls where there's greater receptivity to nuclear, not just in the US, but in sort of other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And I think there's been recent progress globally, which would suggest that we can build nuclear cheaper than we have here recently in the US, with Vogtle being really the only recent example that has actually gone into production. But South Korea can build reactors at 25% of the cost that they can in the US. It's hard to know exactly the price point at the Chinese, but most will say based on duration, it's probably close to the same range that we see coming out of South Korea. And then if you look at what happened with the 4 reactors in the UAE just a few years ago, the cost differential between the 4th unit and the first unit, I'll get the exact percentage, probably not correct, but something in the range of like 33% cheaper. And I think even the statement around Vogtle was that the 4th reactor was significantly cheaper than the first one. And so with enough demand or enough concentration or visibility into what that demand means, we can then build a supply chain around how we build nuclear. We can rebuild a trained workforce to both construct and to sort of maintain a reemergence of a nuclear fleet, which has been sort of holed out in the US and many parts of the world. And so I think there is this question of how do we build, I almost call it a book of business or a book of demand that can sort of serve that. And then the question is, how do we do that in a much more cost-effective way where not everything needs to be unique in terms of how we build that? We can use more standardized, modularized ways to build nuclear. I think, especially with government support, particularly for some of the early reactors that we would want to put into production, get over that initial hurdle, I think you're going to see quite a bit of interest. And then the kind of last thing I'll say on this one is, if you look at let's call them the hyperscalers and their appetite for power, and you think about how challenging it is to both build or construct power today, and might be gas over the short term, which is probably a little faster. And then the transmission capacity to sort of move that, we are already seeing, and I think it's in the public domain around those hyperscalers saying, hey, we're going to need to think about nuclear playing a more important role. And so the balance sheets that they bring, the market capitalization they bring, I think will allow us to have a much more robust conversation about what is the role of nuclear? How do we accelerate that? How do we work through the regulatory requirements to make that happen?
I listened to a really interesting podcast. They actually interviewed the director of the series Chernobyl. You remember that on HBO?
Yeah.
he wrote it and directed it. And as a byproduct of doing that, became a very huge proponent for nuclear energy, which was pretty ironic. So it was a really interesting podcast just to hear from him and how he's covering what is arguably the worst disaster ever for nuclear energy in its existence. And yet he learned so much about why it happened and also about some misperceptions around nuclear and now is actually pretty vocal in favor of it. So interesting twist for sure.
One of those misconceptions or misperceptions I think are hard to sort of get over, but I also think the newest reactors, the passive systems that are there, are much safer, much more reliable than they were back when some of those things happened today. And so there's the hurdle we need to climb over, but I think a lot of the technology, a lot of the advancements that are there make it an incredibly safe alternative. When you think about the fact of how clean it is relative to others.
Right.
It definitely merits more conversation and more exploration of the role it can play in going forward.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, Aaron, Goldman Sachs has projected that by 2030, global data center power demand will grow by as much as 160%. Just talking more about the data centers themselves, do you still think there's a significant opportunity for improving the efficiency of our existing data centers before we talk about adding more?
Yeah. And I'll give you at least a little bit of my knowledge. I'm not as deep within the data center itself and all of the efficiencies, but I think Google publishes pretty good public data on where the efficiencies in their data centers have moved over time. And we've seen a slowing down of the efficiency gains in kind of traditional data centers. I do think with the amount of power that's coming, we're going to start rethinking how we sort of apply some of that to more legacy or the existing data centers to drive additional efficiency. One of the ones I know many are talking about is liquid cooling, the benefits of liquid cooling and how do we sort of apply that and using newest chemistries, newest technologies to sort of drive an efficiency there. And then I think with the racks that we're sort of replacing and the chips that are going to be there, again, driving efficiency. So is there more to squeeze out of the existing data centers? Of course. I think what we're really hoping for is take Blackwell from an NVIDIA standpoint and its claims on energy savings. If we see more step changes like that, I think that the forecast like a Goldman has, maybe it's not nearly as high as it would be because of the efficiencies and that would be gained for that. And then I think the wild card that we don't yet fully know or can quantify is, does the power demand become so extraordinary that actually what was the catalyst to drive the power demand, generative AI, is that turned on its head to say, how do I use generative AI to think about all the inefficiencies and how that entire system works? And can I use that to create new opportunities, new breakthroughs that drive a level of efficiency? We may see that happen, particularly if we're short from a supply standpoint, which we think we will be over the medium term. If we're going to be short, it's very likely you could see the technology that got us here being used to actually be part of the solution for how we can manage the efficiency going forward.
Yeah, certainly makes sense. Aaron, I saw an article about Bitcoin mining operations that have begun redirecting their infrastructure to host AI servers and become another way for them to get the power that they need. Do you expect more of this from startups and other companies who see an opportunity to benefit from this surge in AI and the power demands that it has produced?
I think you very well could see that. And let me unpack why I think that may be the case. Obviously, access to power matters a lot. I mean, and access to fiber, having the right location, there's obviously more considerations than just those two things. You get into price and land access, et cetera. But if you have the land, which has access to fiber, which has access to a low cost advantage power, and the current market you're surveying isn't nearly as lucrative as you thought, but you could repurpose that facility, you could repurpose that property to go serve something that's much more valuable. I think you are seeing some business cases or some evaluation of, hey, do we need to sort of do that going forward? And I think there's going to be plenty of parcels that are out there that have been underutilized or not nearly as valuable as they were intended. And we're going to see that repurposed just because the demand is so strong to get access to power and fiber and those facilities. And they were early. They got access to power, they got access to fiber. And so they're pretty attractive spots. The question will be, for many of those, are they big enough for some of the ones that come? A lot of the things we're seeing from the really large providers are talking is like something like 500 megawatts, a gigawatt, 2 gigawatts, where some of the Bitcoin or the blockchain or the crypto sites weren't really that large. And so they can be repurposed, but probably not for the magnitude of some of the data centers we're sure seeing coming down the way.
Right. So, Aaron, how can utilities and tech companies and governments better collaborate to solve these energy challenges that are in front of us and build more resilient systems? What do you think?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, because I think one of the things we believe needs to happen is much greater collaboration from all of those parties coming together to make this work. And I'll give you a few reasons for that. The data center are bringing really large, chunky demand, which is unique. It's not like a load growth is going to happen 3% per annum and it's going to be that way everywhere. You're seeing these really large. So it creates a wake around that you need to sort of plan for. And so there needs to be some visibility, some transparency with all of those around it who are going to sort of help make that project happen, so that you get the right planning, you get the right permitting, you can get the right interconnections, you get the right government sort of support. At the same time, back to a little bit of everything all at once, utilities, particularly electric utilities, have an extraordinary amount of capital demands coming down their way. We need to think about all the climate issues that are happening. How do we make our system more resilient to climate events going forward? You got the broader electrification push, when how to sort of upgrade our T&D system. And now you've got a whole lot of generation that has to be built. Balance sheets for utilities are going to be likely strained to be able to sort of meet all of this demand. And so there's a question of, okay, if you have these really large data centers you want to interconnect into the system, is the utility going to build out all of that infrastructure? Is the data center going to contribute some of the capital upfront to help manage the implications on the overall system and not sort of penalize residential customers in some of those arrangements? You're going to need collaboration with government to sort of work through some of the regulatory processes in a more expedited way to get these things in. And so what have been unique positions in the past, we think are going to need to come together in a much more collaborative way at those particular locations, and then even across multiple sites, so that we can better sort of plan for the overall system. So we're not overbuilding in some places and then underserving in others, and have much more fragile system as we go forward. So collaboration and greater transparency and partnership is going to be required to pull this off.
Have you seen the private and public sectors showing a willingness to be more collaborative around this, given the urgency that is building every day?
I think you see it in some public forums, and I think you definitely hear it in private as well, a growing recognition from all parties of, we're going to need to be working much more closely with the stakeholders involved to be able to sort of pull this complex situation off. And I think for particular geographies, I obviously live in the US, I live in Chicago. If the U.S. wants to be the leader on that, I think you're going to need to see a growing consortium around that to sort of do that. Because if not, and we already know this, some of those players are going to be looking in other parts of the world to be able to sort of build that capacity, because they can get access to power, they can get access to fiber, they can get access to the right bulk power system quickly. And so it's going to be prudent for all of those stakeholders to come together to find a solution that works for all.
The energy demand and the issues that we've been talking about, how does that vary region to region? And what can the various parts of the world learn from each other in dealing with this? I know a lot of the big tech companies that have driven the AI space and the large language models. I mean, most of them, if not all of them, are US based, and you might even say West Coast based, but they have data centers all over the world. So that demand issue goes with those data centers. So what are your thoughts on this? How would you paint that picture for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. is still going to dominate because of a lot of the reasons you sort of mentioned. That's sort of at least our projections on that. But if you start to look outside the U.S., there's parts of Canada which could make a lot of sense, particularly if there's going to be a behind the meter solution for some of these data centers. You're already seeing quite a bit of demand from Europe. I think it was Eon who announced a a 6 gigawatt queue, which the announcement from the CEO, I think in one of the latest earnings calls, was something like it's so large, it's more than like multiple cities within Germany. And so you see a lot of exploration in parts of Europe. And then in our conversations, there's quite a bit of look at, should we be doing more in the Middle East or certain pockets of Asia as we think about kind of serving that need? There's obviously those same considerations of where can we get access to power quickly? Where do we have access to fiber? You've got the cost situation. And then there's just security as we think about what kind of workloads will be on these data centers and how do we sort of make those trade-offs. But it will not all go to the US. I don't think it can, given how much demand is likely there. And globally, there's going to be a role to play. But similar to finding pockets within the US, you often hear now, moving from tier 1 to tier 2 cities to serve that data center demand. I think you're looking at across the globe, again, where are those kind of tier 1 locations that make a lot of sense? And as we sort of work through the criteria to get data centers interconnected in more quickly, what are those kind of newer markets that are opening up for opportunities? You're going to see that for sure.
Okay. So just as a point of wrap up here, Aaron, where do you believe the industry should prioritize its investments to best prepare for the future energy demands of AI as well as other technologies?
I think this is an extraordinary opportunity for the electric sector. And I think doing it in such a way that can not only meet this near or medium term demand, but to set a platform for how we can still do this in a clean way. There's just an incredible amount of investment that I think needs to go in thoughtfully of how do we sort of plan the bulk power system, both the generation side, the transmission side to sort of do that. And then how do we continue to focus on leveraging this ecosystem, this partnership way model to do this also in a way that benefits all customers. It's not just how do we sort of benefit the hyperscalers that we're trying to sort of serve or to colos, but actually how do we leverage this collaboration to say, look, this is good for all of those new customers, but it should also be good for the rest of the base. And so I think there's an interesting model of how do we invest behind all of this in a way that is good for all stakeholders in there. It's usually never a purely sort of win-win, but we think the conditions are such that we should be making investments. We should be investing in a collaboration model that does benefit all as we try to make this happen.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, you are a wealth of information on this topic, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast to talk about it. We spend a lot of time talking about how automation and AI are transforming businesses and society in general and all the positive things. We don't always talk enough about some of the byproducts or the ramifications of what technology is doing. Certainly the power sourcing aspect is something we have never talked before about on this podcast. So it's been great delving into it with you. Thank you so much for being on and educating us. And I wish you the very best.
Brad, thanks for having me. And there's a lot of benefits of AI to sort of help make our jobs and lives easier. But I think it also has the tremendous potential to transform our electric power system. And so it's a really exciting time and appreciate the opportunity to chat with you about it.
Thank you for listening to Transform Now, the podcast from SS&C Blue Prism. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast channel, as well as YouTube. To stay on top of the hottest topics in the world of intelligent automation, subscribe now. The future of work is here.